What happens when a princess discovers that the man she loves is about to be executed for the crime of loving her back? When Thomas Blackwood stood beneath the gallows with a noose around his neck, condemned to hang for daring to court Princess Isabella without royal permission, it seemed like justice according to ancient law was about to be served. But then something unprecedented happened that shocked the entire kingdom. Princess Isabella had been locked in the highest tower of the castle, imprisoned until she agreed to marry the duke her father had chosen for political alliance. But love has a way of making people do impossible things. In a dramatic escape that defied all expectations, the princess broke free from her prison and rushed to the execution site with a declaration that left everyone speechless. This isn't just another forbidden love story. This is the incredible tale of a woman who was willing to sacrifice her life for the man she loved, and how that sacrifice sparked a revolution in thinking about love, leadership, and what it truly means to be noble. A story that proves sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from warriors on battlefields, but from lovers willing to face death for each other. Today I'm going to tell you the amazing story of how a princess's desperate gamble to save her beloved's life led to the most unconventional trial in royal history, and how a humble blacksmith's apprentice proved that true nobility comes from character, not birth. But first, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? I love seeing our global community grow. And if you're ready for a story that combines heart-stopping drama, true love, and an ending that will restore your faith in justice, smash that like button and subscribe with notifications on. Because what Princess Isabella did when she saw the man she loved about to die will prove that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is a love willing to sacrifice everything. Are you ready to witness courage that changed a kingdom? The rope swayed gently in the autumn breeze as Thomas Blackwood stood beneath the gallows, his hands bound behind his back and a noose waiting above his head. The young blacksmith's apprentice had never imagined that his life would end this way, condemned to hang for the crime of loving someone far above his station. The crowd gathered in the castle courtyard was larger than usual for an execution, drawn not by bloodlust but by the tragic romance that had captured the kingdom's attention and divided public opinion between those who believed in the sanctity of royal blood and those who thought love should transcend social boundaries. King Harold stood on his royal balcony, his weathered face set in stone as he prepared to watch justice be carried out according to the ancient laws of the realm. At 62, he had ruled for over 3 decades with an iron fist, maintaining order through strict adherence to tradition and the unwavering belief that the monarchy's authority came directly from divine mandate. His daughter's betrayal had shaken him to his very core, not just as a king but as a father who had devoted his life to preparing her for the responsibilities that came with royal blood. Princess Isabella was nowhere to be seen among the spectators, having been locked in the highest tower of the castle since her forbidden relationship with Thomas had been discovered 3 weeks earlier. The king had made it clear that she would remain imprisoned until she came to her senses and agreed to marry Duke Edmund of Castleton, a political alliance that would strengthen the kingdom's defenses against their aggressive neighbors to the north. The princess's refusal to even consider the arrangement had only deepened her father's resolve to eliminate the source of her rebellion once and for all. The charges against Thomas were as ancient as they were severe: seduction of royal blood, conspiracy against the crown, and corrupting the moral virtue of the king's heir. Under the kingdom's laws, any commoner who dared to court a member of the royal family without explicit permission was guilty of treason, a crime punishable by death. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Love letters written in Thomas's own hand, witness testimony from servants who had observed their secret meetings, and most damning of all, the princess's own tearful confession during her interrogation. "Thomas Blackwood," the royal herald proclaimed, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard, "you stand condemned for the crime of corrupting Princess Isabella and conspiring to undermine the natural order established by God and crown. Do you have any final words before sentence is carried out?" Thomas raised his head to look directly at King Harold, his brown eyes reflecting neither fear nor anger, but a profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just his own fate but the tragedy that his love had brought upon the woman he cherished more than life itself. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice clear and strong despite the circumstances, "I regret nothing except the pain my actions have caused Princess Isabella. My love for her was pure and true, and if that love is a crime worthy of death, then I accept my punishment willingly." The king's jaw tightened at these words, his hands gripping the stone balustrade until his knuckles turned white. Part of him had hoped that facing death would break the young man's spirit and lead to a plea for mercy that would acknowledge the wrongfulness of his presumptuous love. Instead, Thomas's dignity and unwavering devotion only served to remind Harold of the qualities that had drawn his daughter to this unsuitable match in the first place. The executioner, a hooded figure whose identity was hidden to protect him from the vengeance of grieving families, stepped forward to place the noose around Thomas's neck. The rough hemp rope scratched against his skin as it was positioned correctly, and Thomas closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself one final moment to remember Isabella's laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke about her dreams for the kingdom, and the stolen kisses they had shared in the castle gardens when they thought no one was watching. "Wait!" A voice suddenly rang out across the courtyard, cutting through the solemn atmosphere like a sword through silk. Every head turned toward the castle entrance, where a figure in a hooded cloak was pushing through the crowd with desperate urgency. The guards moved to intercept the intruder, but something about the person's bearing and the way they carried themselves made several courtiers gasp in recognition. The figure threw back their hood, revealing the tear-stained but determined face of Princess Isabella herself. Her auburn hair had been hastily braided, and she wore a simple brown dress that belonged to one of her servants, a disguise that had apparently allowed her to escape from her tower prison and make her way to the courtyard undetected. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs as they realized that the princess had somehow broken free from what everyone had assumed was an impregnable confinement. "Father, stop this madness!" Isabella cried out, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard as she continued to push through the crowd toward the gallows. "If you must have blood for this supposed crime, then take mine instead. I am the one who initiated our relationship. I am the one who pursued Thomas despite knowing the consequences, and I am the one who should face punishment for defying your will." King Harold's face went pale as he watched his daughter approach the scaffold, his mind racing to understand how she had managed to escape from a tower that was supposed to be under constant guard. The princess's lady-in-waiting, Lady Margaret, had obviously been complicit in the escape, and there would be severe consequences for anyone who had aided in this rebellion against royal authority. The guards hesitated as Princess Isabella approached the gallows, uncertain whether they should arrest the king's daughter or allow her to continue her dramatic intervention. Their training had never prepared them for a situation where a member of the royal family was actively defying the monarch's direct orders in such a public manner. The crowd watched in fascination as the princess climbed the steps to the scaffold with the same dignity and grace she had always displayed at court functions, her chin held high despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Isabella, return to your chambers immediately," King Harold commanded from the balcony, his voice thundering across the courtyard with all the authority he could muster. "You will not make a spectacle of yourself or diminish the dignity of the crown with this foolish display." But even as he spoke the words, Harold could see the determination in his daughter's eyes, the same stubborn resolve that had characterized her mother, Queen Eleanor, who had died when Isabella was only 12 years old. "I will not return, father," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite her emotional state. "I cannot stand by and watch an innocent man die for the crime of loving me. Thomas has done nothing wrong except see past the crown and titles to the woman beneath. If that makes him guilty of treason, then I am equally guilty and demand to share his fate." She moved to stand beside Thomas on the scaffold, taking his bound hands in hers despite the shocked protests of the executioner. The young blacksmith's apprentice looked at the princess with a mixture of love and horror, understanding what she was attempting to do but desperate to prevent her from sacrificing herself for his sake. "Isabella, no," he whispered urgently. "You cannot do this. Your life is worth more than mine, your future is more important than my past. Please, I beg you, don't throw away everything you could become for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Isabella replied, her voice growing stronger as she addressed not just Thomas but the entire assembled crowd. "You mean someone who sees the common people as human beings deserving of dignity and respect? Someone who has spent his life creating beautiful things with his hands rather than destroying them with weapons? Someone who has shown me what true love means, without any thought of political gain or personal advancement. Her words carried across the courtyard, and many in the crowd began to murmur their agreement. Thomas Blackwood was indeed well regarded among the common people, known for his skilled craftsmanship, his generosity to those less fortunate, and his gentle nature that seemed at odds with his physically demanding profession. Unlike many of the nobles who courted Princess Isabella for her title and dowry, Thomas had fallen in love with her intelligence, her compassion for her subjects, and her genuine desire to improve life for everyone in the kingdom. King Harold descended from the balcony, his royal guards flanking him as he approached the scaffold. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but those who knew him well could see the pain beneath the anger. This public defiance was not just a challenge to his authority as a monarch, but a rejection of everything he had tried to teach his daughter about duty, responsibility, and the sacrifices required of those born to rule. "You speak of love as if it were the highest virtue," the king said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "But what of duty? What of the obligations you owe to your bloodline, to your people, to the future of this kingdom? Your marriage to Duke Edmund would secure our northern borders and prevent a war that could cost thousands of lives. Is your personal happiness worth more than the safety and prosperity of your subjects?" Isabella's response came without hesitation, delivered with the conviction of someone who had spent weeks thinking about nothing else. "Father, you taught me that a ruler's first responsibility is to her people. How can I rule effectively if I enter into a loveless marriage that will fill me with resentment and bitterness? How can I make wise decisions about matters of the heart when I have never been allowed to follow my own? The people need leaders who understand love, sacrifice, and genuine human emotion, not political puppets who have been trained to suppress their humanity in service to abstract concepts of duty." The crowd was completely silent now, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come. A princess was publicly challenging her father's authority, defending the man she loved, and articulating a vision of monarchy that emphasized human connection over political calculation. Many of the common people in the crowd had never heard such ideas expressed so eloquently, and they found themselves nodding in agreement with concepts they had never been able to put into words. Thomas looked at Isabella with a mixture of admiration and despair, understanding that she was fighting not just for his life but for a completely different way of thinking about power, responsibility, and the relationship between rulers and their subjects. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "I would rather die knowing that you lived to become the queen your people deserve than live knowing that my survival cost the kingdom its future. Please, for the sake of everyone who depends on your wisdom and compassion, step down from this scaffold and fulfill your destiny." "My destiny," Isabella replied, turning to face the crowd rather than her father, "is to show the people of this kingdom that love is not weakness, that compassion is not foolishness, and that true strength comes from following your heart even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. If I must die to prove these truths, then so be it. But I will not live a lie for the sake of political convenience." The standoff on the scaffold created a tension that seemed to electrify the very air in the courtyard, with hundreds of spectators holding their breath as they waited to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve itself. King Harold found himself facing an impossible choice: order his daughter's execution alongside her lover and lose his heir while appearing tyrannical to his subjects, or show mercy and undermine the very foundations of royal authority that had maintained order in the kingdom for centuries. Lady Margaret, Princess Isabella's loyal lady-in-waiting, pushed through the crowd and fell to her knees before the king, her face streaked with tears as she accepted responsibility for her role in the princess's escape. "Your Majesty," she pleaded, "I helped Princess Isabella leave her chambers because I could not bear to see her suffer while an innocent man died for loving her. The princess speaks the truth. Their love is pure and honest, unlike the political machinations that surround most royal marriages." The king's advisors, who had been watching the drama unfold from their positions near the royal platform, began to whisper urgently among themselves about the implications of this crisis. Lord Chancellor William approached the king with careful steps, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "Your Majesty, we must consider the political ramifications of whatever decision you make here today. The people are watching, and our enemies in neighboring kingdoms will interpret any sign of weakness as an opportunity to challenge our authority." But even as the political calculations swirled around him, King Harold found himself looking at his daughter with new eyes. The young woman standing defiantly on the scaffold bore little resemblance to the obedient child he remembered, and her passionate defense of her beliefs reminded him painfully of his late wife, Queen Eleanor, who had possessed the same fierce independence and unwavering moral conviction that had both frustrated and inspired him throughout their marriage. "Isabella," the king said quietly, stepping closer to the scaffold, "you ask me to choose between my duty as a monarch and my love as a father. But you fail to understand that sometimes these responsibilities are one and the same. Everything I have done, every difficult decision I have made, has been motivated by my desire to leave you and your future children a kingdom that is strong, prosperous, and secure." "And I understand that, father," Isabella replied, her voice softening slightly as she recognized the genuine pain in her father's eyes. "But strength does not come from forcing people into marriages they despise, and security does not come from ruling through fear and intimidation. The people need to see their leaders as human beings who understand their struggles and share their hopes. How can I be that kind of queen if I have never been allowed to experience love, loss, or the consequences of following my conscience?" Thomas, who had been listening to this exchange in amazement, suddenly found his voice. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing the king directly, "Princess Isabella has shown me that true nobility comes not from birth but from character. She has visited the sick in the lower quarters of the city, she has used her own allowance to buy food for starving families, and she has spent countless hours studying the problems that face your kingdom and proposing solutions that would benefit everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful." These words caused a murmur of agreement to ripple through the crowd, many of whom had indeed witnessed the princess's charitable activities and had been touched by her genuine concern for their welfare. Unlike many nobles who made token gestures of charity for political benefit, Isabella had consistently demonstrated a deep understanding of the challenges faced by common people and a sincere desire to use her position to address systemic inequalities. The king found himself remembering incidents from his daughter's childhood and adolescence that he had dismissed as youthful idealism but which now seemed to reveal a pattern of genuine compassion and wisdom. Isabella had always questioned why certain people had so much while others had so little, had always been drawn to the servants and common folk rather than the visiting nobles, and had always possessed an intuitive understanding of justice that sometimes put her at odds with established traditions. "You speak of love and compassion as if they were sufficient qualifications for rulership," King Harold said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "But what of the practical skills needed to govern? What of the ability to make difficult decisions that may cause suffering to some for the greater good of many? What of the strength needed to defend the kingdom against those who would destroy everything we have built?" Isabella's response revealed the depth of thought she had given to these questions during her weeks of imprisonment. "Father, I have watched you rule for my entire life, and I have seen how the burden of making those difficult decisions has affected you. You carry the weight of every choice, every sacrifice, every compromise required by your position. But you have also shown me that the greatest leaders are those who feel the cost of their decisions most deeply, who understand that their power comes with an obligation to serve others rather than themselves." The crowd had begun to shift, with many people moving closer to the scaffold to better hear this extraordinary conversation between father and daughter. Some of the nobles in attendance looked uncomfortable with the direction of the discussion, recognizing that the princess's words contained implicit criticism of the way they had traditionally exercised their own authority and privileges. Thomas looked between the king and the princess, understanding that his fate was being decided not just by royal decree but by a fundamental examination of what it meant to rule justly in a world where power was traditionally inherited rather than earned. His love for Isabella had inadvertently sparked a conversation about the very nature of monarchy, the relationship between rulers and subjects, and the role that personal virtue should play in political leadership. As the debate continued on the scaffold, an unexpected voice joined the conversation from within the crowd. Father Benedict, the castle's elderly chaplain who had served the royal family for over 40 years, stepped forward with a measured dignity that had made him a trusted advisor to 3 generations of monarchs. His presence immediately commanded respect from both nobles and commoners alike, as his reputation for wisdom and moral integrity was beyond question throughout the kingdom. "Your Majesty," Father Benedict said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "if I may speak on a matter that touches not just temporal law but eternal justice. I have watched Princess Isabella grow from a child into a woman of remarkable character, and I have observed the young man Thomas in his daily life and work. What I have seen convinces me that their love is not the product of base desires or political ambition, but of genuine mutual respect and shared values that could strengthen rather than weaken the crown. The king's expression softened slightly at the chaplain's intervention, recognizing that Father Benedict's opinion carried weight not just because of his religious authority but because of his long service and intimate knowledge of the royal family. The old priest had been present at Isabella's birth, had conducted her religious education, and had served as confessor to both the late Queen Eleanor and King Harold himself during their most difficult moments. Furthermore, Father Benedict continued, I would remind your Majesty of the example set by your own grandfather, King Richard the Just, who earned his sobriquet not through rigid adherence to tradition but through his willingness to adapt ancient laws to serve justice and mercy. When faced with a similar situation involving his sister and a commoner she loved, King Richard chose to elevate the man's station rather than destroy the union, creating one of the strongest noble houses in the kingdom and securing an alliance that served the realm for generations. This historical reference caused a stir among the older nobles in the crowd, many of whom remembered the stories of King Richard's unconventional decisions and the prosperity they had brought to the kingdom. The precedent suggested that royal marriages based on love rather than political calculation were not inherently destructive to monarchical authority, and might even prove beneficial if handled with wisdom and care. Princess Isabella seized upon this opening, her voice growing stronger as she sensed the possibility of reaching her father through reason rather than defiance. Father Benedict speaks truly, Father. You have always taught me to study our kingdom's history, to learn from the successes and failures of our ancestors. King Richard understood that the strength of the monarchy comes not from blind obedience to tradition, but from the ability to inspire loyalty through just and merciful rule. Thomas, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, found himself speaking words he had never planned to say. Your Majesty, I make no claim to nobility or political wisdom, but I swear to you that my love for Princess Isabella has only increased my devotion to this kingdom and its people. If you would allow me to prove my worth through service rather than birth, I would dedicate my life to supporting her in whatever role you deem appropriate, whether as consort, advisor, or simply as a loving husband who helps her bear the burdens of leadership. The crowd had begun to murmur approval at these words, recognizing in Thomas's pledge the kind of honest commitment that was often lacking in political marriages arranged for strategic advantage. Many of the common people present had personal experience with the young blacksmith's character and integrity, having benefited from his skill, his fair dealing, and his willingness to help those in need without expectation of reward. King Harold looked around the courtyard, seeing for the first time the faces of his subjects rather than simply a crowd of spectators. What he observed there was not the rebellious mob he had feared, but a group of people who were genuinely moved by the love story playing out before them and who seemed to view his daughter's defiance not as treason but as an example of the kind of moral courage they hoped to see in their future queen. You ask me to overturn centuries of law and tradition, the king said slowly, to ignore the practical necessities of statecraft for the sake of romantic sentiment. You ask me to risk the stability of the kingdom, the security of our borders, and the respect of our allies for an emotion that may fade with time and leave nothing but regret in its wake. No, Father, Isabella replied, her voice carrying a new note of certainty. I ask you to trust in the wisdom that you and Mother instilled in me, to believe that love built on mutual respect and shared values is stronger than alliances built on fear and calculation. I ask you to remember that the greatest leaders in our history were those who had the courage to choose what was right over what was expected, even when that choice required them to stand alone against the criticism of their contemporaries. The reference to Queen Eleanor had a visible effect on King Harold, whose expression softened as he remembered his beloved wife's unwavering conviction that monarchy was a sacred trust that required its holders to serve something greater than their own interests. Eleanor had often argued that the crown's legitimacy came not from divine appointment alone, but from the consent and love of the people, which could only be maintained through just and compassionate rule. Father Benedict stepped closer to the scaffold, his aged hands clasped in a gesture of prayer and supplication. Your Majesty, I have served your family faithfully for 4 decades, and I have never asked for personal favors or exceptions to established law. But today, I implore you to consider that mercy and justice are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of righteous rule. Show mercy to these young people. and you will demonstrate the kind of justice that makes subjects into loyal citizens rather than fearful servants. The weight of the moment pressed down upon King Harold as he stood before the scaffold, feeling the eyes of his entire kingdom upon him. The decision he made in the next few minutes would not only determine the fate of his daughter and the young man she loved, but would define his legacy as a ruler and set a precedent that would influence monarchical authority for generations to come. The silence in the courtyard was so complete that the sound of his own heartbeat seemed to echo in his ears. "Thomas Blackwood," the king said finally, his voice carrying a new tone that caused everyone present to lean forward in anticipation. "You stand accused of loving my daughter without permission, of corrupting royal blood, and of undermining the natural order of society. These are serious charges that have traditionally carried the penalty of death." He paused, allowing the weight of these words to settle over the crowd before continuing. "However," King Harold continued, "I have heard testimony today that suggests your character and intentions may be more honorable than the law assumes possible for one of your station. Father Benedict speaks of historical precedent, my daughter speaks of justice and mercy, and you yourself speak of service and devotion to the kingdom. These are not the words of a traitor or a seducer, but of a man who may indeed be worthy of the extraordinary trust my daughter has placed in you." The crowd began to stir with hope and excitement, sensing that the king might be moving toward mercy rather than execution. Thomas felt his knees grow weak with relief and disbelief, hardly daring to hope that he might live to see another sunset, let alone a future with the woman he loved more than life itself. "But," the king continued, raising his hand to quiet the murmurs, "if I am to overturn the ancient laws of this kingdom, if I am to risk the stability of our alliances and the respect of our neighboring monarchs, then I must have assurance that this decision will serve the greater good rather than merely indulging romantic sentiment. Thomas Blackwood, will you accept a trial by ordeal that will test not just your love for my daughter, but your commitment to the welfare of this kingdom and its people?" The concept of trial by ordeal was an ancient tradition that allowed accused persons to prove their innocence or worthiness through acts of courage, endurance, or sacrifice that supposedly revealed divine judgment about their character. Such trials were rarely used in modern times, but they remained part of the kingdom's legal code and could be invoked in extraordinary circumstances where normal judicial procedures seemed inadequate. "I accept whatever trial your majesty deems appropriate," Thomas replied without hesitation, his voice strong despite the uncertainty of what might be required of him. "My love for Princess Isabella is genuine, and my commitment to serving this kingdom is absolute. I will prove both through whatever means you judge necessary." Princess Isabella looked at her father with a mixture of hope and apprehension, understanding that while this development offered a chance for Thomas to save his life, it also introduced new dangers and uncertainties. "Father," she said quietly, "what manner of trial do you propose? Thomas has already demonstrated his character through years of honest labor and service to our people. What more could be required to prove his worth?" King Harold's response revealed that he had been considering this possibility throughout the confrontation, weighing the political necessities against his growing recognition of his daughter's wisdom and the genuine nature of her love for Thomas. "The trial I propose is not one of physical courage or endurance, but of wisdom, judgment, and dedication to the common good. Thomas Blackwood will serve as administrator of the eastern provinces for 1 year, managing the collection of taxes, the administration of justice, and the organization of public works in the kingdom's most challenging region." This proposal caused a sensation among the crowd, as the eastern provinces were known to be the most difficult administrative assignment in the kingdom. The region was plagued by bandits, frequent disputes between neighboring lords, and complex economic problems that had frustrated several previous administrators. It was work that traditionally required a noble education, extensive political connections, and considerable administrative experience. "If Thomas can bring peace and prosperity to the eastern provinces," the king continued, "if he can demonstrate that his character and judgment are equal to the challenges of governance, then I will consider him worthy of my daughter's hand and will grant them permission to marry with my blessing. But if he fails, if the provinces fall into chaos or rebellion under his administration, then he will face exile from the kingdom, and Isabella will fulfill her duty by marrying Duke Edmund as originally planned." The terms of the trial were clearly intended to be challenging but not impossible, giving Thomas a genuine opportunity to prove himself while also addressing the king's concerns about practical governance and administrative competence. The year-long time frame would also allow public opinion to develop around the unusual arrangement, potentially creating popular support for the match if Thomas succeeded in his assigned duties. Thomas looked at Princess Isabella, seeing in her eyes both encouragement and concern about the magnitude of the challenge he was accepting. The eastern provinces were indeed notorious for their problems, and failure would mean not just his own exile but the forced marriage of the woman he loved to a man she despised. Yet the alternative was immediate death, and at least this trial offered hope for a future together if he could prove himself worthy of the trust the king was offering. "I accept these terms," Thomas said formally, "and I pledge to serve the eastern provinces with all the skill, dedication, and wisdom I possess. If I succeed, I ask only for Princess Isabella's hand in marriage and the opportunity to serve this kingdom for the rest of my life. If I fail, I will accept exile without complaint and will never again trouble the royal family or undermine the stability of the realm." 1 year later, the same courtyard that had witnessed the dramatic confrontation between King Harold and his daughter was filled with celebration as news arrived of the remarkable transformation that had taken place in the eastern provinces under Thomas Blackwood's administration. Messengers had been arriving throughout the week with reports that seemed almost too good to be believed. Bandit attacks had virtually ceased, tax collection had increased by 40% while somehow reducing the burden on individual taxpayers, and 3 new trade routes had been established that were bringing unprecedented prosperity to the region. Princess Isabella stood once again on the castle's main balcony, but this time her expression was one of joy and vindication rather than defiance and desperation. The year of separation from Thomas had been difficult beyond description, filled with anxious moments when reports from the eastern provinces suggested that his task might prove impossible. There had been times when armed rebellions threatened to overwhelm his small administrative staff, moments when natural disasters tested his ability to organize relief efforts, and countless daily challenges that would have defeated many men with far more political experience. King Harold joined his daughter on the balcony, carrying in his hands the latest dispatch from the eastern provinces, a detailed report that described not just the statistical improvements in the region's governance, but the innovative methods Thomas had developed to achieve these results. Rather than relying on traditional authoritarian approaches, the young administrator had implemented a system of local councils that gave common people a voice in decisions that affected their daily lives, had established fair and transparent procedures for resolving disputes, and had created economic incentives that encouraged cooperation rather than competition between different communities. "I must confess," the king said quietly to his daughter, "that when I designed this trial, I expected Thomas to fail. Not because I wished him ill, but because I believed that effective governance required the kind of education and training that only noble birth could provide. I have been proven wrong in the most remarkable way possible." The reports described how Thomas had won the loyalty of the eastern provinces not through force or bribery, but by demonstrating genuine concern for the welfare of all the people under his administration, regardless of their social status or economic circumstances. He had personally visited every major town and village in the region, had listened carefully to local concerns and grievances, and had developed solutions that addressed underlying causes rather than merely treating symptoms of larger problems. "Father," Isabella replied, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction, "Thomas has proven what I always believed, that true leadership comes from the heart as much as from the mind, and that people will follow someone they trust and respect far more readily than someone they merely fear." The eastern provinces flourished under his care because he saw the people there not as subjects to be controlled, but as fellow human beings whose happiness and prosperity were worth pursuing for their own sake. The transformation of the eastern provinces had implications that extended far beyond the immediate question of Thomas and Isabella's marriage. Other kingdoms had begun to take notice of the innovative administrative methods being employed there, and several had sent diplomatic missions to study these new approaches to governance. What had begun as a test of one man's character had evolved into a demonstration of alternative methods of rule that challenged traditional assumptions about authority and social hierarchy. As the afternoon progressed, a long-awaited arrival finally materialized as Thomas himself appeared at the head of a small delegation from the eastern provinces. The year of responsibility had visibly matured him, adding an air of quiet confidence to his natural dignity, and giving him the bearing of someone who had learned to shoulder significant burdens with grace and competence. The crowd that gathered to welcome him back included many of the same people who had witnessed his near execution a year earlier, but their expressions now showed admiration and respect rather than mere curiosity. Thomas's reunion with Princess Isabella was emotionally charged but conducted with the formal dignity appropriate to their public setting. Their embrace was brief but heartfelt, conveying a year's worth of longing and the joy of vindicated faith in each other. The crowd cheered their obvious happiness, understanding that they were witnessing not just a personal reunion but the culmination of a love story that had captured the kingdom's imagination and challenged its assumptions about class and worthiness. King Harold descended from the balcony to personally greet the man who had so thoroughly exceeded his expectations, offering his hand in a gesture that acknowledged not just Thomas's success but his acceptance as a future member of the royal family. "Thomas Blackwood," the king said formally, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "you have fulfilled the terms of your trial beyond my highest hopes and have proven yourself worthy not just of my daughter's love, but of the trust and respect of an entire kingdom." The formal announcement of the engagement was met with thunderous applause from the assembled crowd, many of whom had followed the story of Thomas and Isabella's love with the kind of intense interest usually reserved for epic tales and romantic legends. Their story had become a symbol of hope for common people throughout the kingdom, proof that merit and character could sometimes triumph over accident of birth and inherited privilege. "Furthermore," King Harold continued, "in recognition of your exceptional service to the crown and your demonstrated capacity for wise governance, I hereby grant you the title of Earl of the Eastern Provinces, with all the rights and responsibilities that position entails. You will continue to administer that region as its hereditary lord, ensuring that the remarkable progress achieved this year will continue for generations to come." This announcement caused another wave of excitement among the crowd, as the creation of a new earldom specifically to recognize Thomas's achievements was unprecedented in the kingdom's history. The decision effectively solved the political problem of a princess marrying beneath her station by elevating Thomas to a rank that made their union more acceptable to traditional nobles, while still maintaining the principle that exceptional merit could be rewarded regardless of original social status. The wedding of Princess Isabella and Earl Thomas took place 3 months later in the greatest celebration the kingdom had seen in decades. The ceremony itself was held in the castle's great cathedral, with representatives from neighboring kingdoms in attendance to witness this unprecedented union between a princess and a man who had earned his noble status through merit rather than inheritance. The bride was radiant in a gown of white silk embroidered with gold thread, while the groom wore the deep blue and silver colors of his new earldom, looking every inch the nobleman he had become through his own efforts and character. King Harold officiated at the ceremony himself, a gesture that demonstrated his complete acceptance of the match and his confidence in Thomas's worthiness to join the royal family. As he spoke the words that would bind his daughter to the man she had risked everything to save, the king reflected on how profoundly his own understanding of leadership and authority had been changed by the events of the past year. The success of Thomas's administration in the eastern provinces had forced him to reconsider many of his assumptions about governance, social hierarchy, and the sources of legitimate political power. The wedding feast that followed was notable not just for its magnificence but for the unprecedented mixing of social classes among the guests. Lords and ladies sat alongside master craftsmen and successful merchants, while representatives from the eastern provinces shared tables with foreign diplomats and traditional nobility. This integration reflected the new social mobility that Thomas's elevation had come to symbolize, suggesting that the rigid class boundaries that had defined the kingdom for centuries might be beginning to evolve. Princess Isabella, now Countess of the Eastern Provinces, delivered a speech during the celebration that articulated her vision for a new kind of monarchy, one that would be based on service to the people rather than dominance over them, that would recognize merit wherever it was found, and that would use its power to create opportunities for all citizens to improve their circumstances through honest effort and moral character. Her words were carefully chosen to honor tradition while also suggesting the possibility of beneficial change. "My lords and ladies, honored guests from near and far," Isabella began, her voice carrying clearly through the great hall. "Today's celebration marks not just the union of two hearts, but the affirmation of principles that I believe can strengthen and ennoble our kingdom. We have seen that love built on mutual respect and shared values creates stronger bonds than alliances built on political calculation alone. We have seen that wisdom and administrative skill can be found in unexpected places, and that the measure of a person's worth lies in their character and actions rather than their parentage." The applause that greeted these words came not just from the common people present, but from many of the nobles who had witnessed the positive results of Thomas's unconventional approach to governance. The success of the eastern provinces had created prosperity that benefited everyone in the kingdom, and even the most traditional aristocrats found it difficult to argue with results that had strengthened the realm's economy and enhanced its reputation among neighboring kingdoms. Thomas rose to respond to his new wife's speech, offering his own perspective on the year that had transformed his life and challenged him to grow beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. "Your Majesties, my lords and ladies, friends from every corner of our kingdom," he began, his voice reflecting the confidence he had gained through his experiences in the eastern provinces. "I stand before you today not as the same man who once knelt beneath a hangman's noose, but as someone who has been granted the extraordinary opportunity to serve the people of this realm, and to prove that the capacity for leadership exists in many forms and places." His words carried special weight because everyone present knew the remarkable journey he had traveled from condemned prisoner to respected nobleman. The transformation was not just one of status, but of character development and demonstrated capability that had been tested under the most challenging circumstances possible. The year I spent administering the eastern provinces taught me that effective governance requires not just authority and tradition, but also humility, empathy, and the willingness to listen to wisdom wherever it may be found, Thomas continued. The improvements in that region came not from my individual efforts alone, but from the collective wisdom and energy of thousands of people who had been waiting for someone to trust in their capabilities and good intentions. The success story of the eastern provinces had indeed become a model that other regions of the kingdom were beginning to emulate. The innovative administrative practices that Thomas had developed, including local councils, transparent dispute resolution procedures, and economic policies that encouraged cooperation, were being studied and adapted by governors throughout the realm, creating a gradual transformation in the relationship between rulers and subjects. King Harold watched this celebration with a mixture of pride and wonder, recognizing that his daughter's defiant stand on the scaffold had ultimately led to positive changes that extended far beyond her personal happiness. The kingdom was stronger, more prosperous, and more unified than it had been in years, and much of this progress could be traced directly to the unconventional path that had brought Thomas into the royal family. As the evening progressed, the celebration evolved into a festival that spilled out from the castle into the surrounding town, with music, dancing, and storytelling that continued well into the night. Common people who had never before been invited to participate in royal festivities found themselves welcomed as honored guests, creating memories that would be passed down through generations as evidence of a time when social barriers had been temporarily dissolved in celebration of love and merit. The story of Princess Isabella and Earl Thomas became legendary throughout the kingdom and beyond, told and retold as an example of how courage, love, and unwavering principle could overcome even the most entrenched traditions and create positive change that benefited everyone. Their marriage produced 3 children who grew up understanding that nobility was something to be earned through service rather than simply inherited through birth, and who carried forward their parents' commitment to just and compassionate governance. Years later, when King Harold was asked by visiting dignitaries about the wisdom of allowing his daughter to marry beneath her station, he would smile and point to the prosperity and stability of his kingdom as evidence that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the flexibility to adapt ancient principles to new circumstances. The eastern provinces remained the most efficiently governed and prosperous region in the kingdom, serving as a living testament to the power of leadership based on merit, compassion, and genuine concern for the welfare of all people. The love story that had begun with a condemned man and a defiant princess became a founding myth for a new understanding of monarchy, one that maintained respect for tradition while also embracing the possibility of positive change, one that honored the past while also creating opportunities for a better future. Their example inspired other kingdoms to examine their own assumptions about class, authority, and the sources of legitimate power, contributing to a gradual transformation in the political landscape that would continue for generations.